This episode mentions alcoholism, death, and incarceration. Please take care of yourself as you listen to this episode. Welcome back to Turbulent Beauty. As I was trying to figure out the best way to introduce this episode, I really struggled coming up with the right words. While we were recording this episode, I felt anger, frustration, sadness, awe, and hope. I'm sure many of you will feel much the same as I did. I want to welcome Robin, and I'm really glad to be able to bring her voice forward. You and I met almost 20 years ago, and at that time, I think you had been out of prison for 2 years. Was it 2 years that you had been out, or a little less than 2 years that you'd been out?
Yeah, I would say in the 2-year area. It wasn't much more than that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that at that time you had an incredible story. And thanks to the lovely world of social media, you and I have been able to stay in the periphery of each other's lives for the last almost 18 years. And I've been able to watch the beautiful direction that your life has gone into and what you've done with the circumstances that you had to endure and what you've gone through. And I would just really would like to hear a bit about how you got here, what changed, what happened, and how that changed the direction that your life went into. And if you're comfortable, if you could share about how you became incarcerated to begin with.
Sure. I think it's always good to take this section and begin at the beginning of what it is we want to talk about this morning. So I was 34 years old, and at that point, I had had a good amount of life experience, but I certainly have much more now. And reflecting back, I can see the path more clearly of how things ended up turning out the way they did. And I never really say what happened to me because when I look back, I can see that my choices and generations behind me played into the actual event that brought me to being incarcerated. Let's see. I was 34 years old. I had a history of recreational alcohol use. This is from my perspective at the time. And I later learned there was quite a bit of addiction and alcoholism in my family, but I wasn't so aware of it at the time. Let's see, if I look back, I know that in high school, I was an athlete, I was an A student, and it looked like that there was going to be some promising future. The thing that I didn't have was much guidance. And so, left to my own devices, I was making my own choices and just going along my merry way in my life. I didn't go to college, things didn't work out that way. However, a lot of my friends went to college, and I went on the weekends because I thought I just had the best of that world just going for the parties. And my weekend would end up being maybe 3 or 4 days long, but in any event, that's what my college experience was at the time. So I took different jobs. I finally ended up working for the state of Connecticut. I worked in direct care staffing in what they used to call, and it's even hard for me to say this now, they used to call it the Department of Mental Retardation. Thank God for
Oof, yeah,
change. And it is
right?
now mental health and addiction services. But man, at the time, thought nothing of that. But so that's a perfect example of how things change and how large or small groups of people can influence that change. So, anyway, I worked for the state for nearly 10 years. And then after an injury, I wasn't able to go back to that job. So that put me into my early 30s. At that time, I'd already come out when I was 15 years old. It certainly rocked my family's world. It was the 80s, 79, 80. There wasn't much of an acceptance, but I didn't really care because I was quite defiant in many areas of my life. And so coming from that place, I didn't even allow it to affect me. And I was self centered and righteous and defiant. And so I just figured, if you don't like it, too bad for you. This is who I am and how I'm going to live. The destruction was the way I was living. And in the 80s into the 90s, much of the lifestyle seemed to revolve around a club scene because being out and gay wasn't really something people were taking chances with. And so I ended up in this lifestyle that I don't recall choosing it. My life just took that direction. So there was a lot of drinking involved. I ended up steering away from the academics and the athletics into this world of drinking and partying and just being who I thought I should be and all of that kind of stuff. So it led me into this world of relationships and having fun, drinking for fun, and all that kind of stuff. So now I'm in my early 30s. Many of my friends have married or settled down and they're having children and all that stuff. And many of my gay friends were still just clubbing it up relationship to relationship. And I think that's about the time the AIDS epidemic had hit, and that
Mhm.
was devastating our community. So, a couple of my friends were getting married to women, and there were people I didn't really know all that well. And at the time, I didn't really care for them much, but it was an event where in my small group of people, everybody was going. It was going to be at the place we all hang out, the actual ceremony and the reception. The night of the wedding comes, and my girlfriend and I meet up with another friend. And my other friend is wanting to drink alcohol before the wedding. And I just thought, I was in my 30s by then. I wasn't drinking every single day, I was recreationally drinking. And I thought, this is like high school. We don't pregame before a wedding, I don't think. So I just thought, I'm glad I'm not in that frame of mind. Or I think once we get there and get to the place it's happening, I'm sure that we will have plenty of alcohol. And we certainly at this point in our lives can afford to buy those drinks. It just seemed a little weird. Get to the wedding, the reception happens, ceremony reception. And then the end of the night comes. And so place is going to be closing. People are in whatever condition they're in. And I happen to be one of those people who wasn't a person who passed out early. I wasn't a puker. I ended up making it to the end of the night all the time, which I guess isn't that great of a thing because that's part of what got me into this major situation. So it's time to go. My girlfriend and I jump in my truck, and I was taking her home. And where she lived, not maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes from where we were. So there was a part of the road where we were eventually going to get on the highway, but it's a straightaway secondary road. And there's a part where there's two lanes of traffic coming up to a light. And then after you go through the light, it merges to one lane. And then straight ahead is where you get on the highway. Traveling down that road, and there's a car in the other lane next to me and the right hand side of me. And that car went ahead to get the lane ahead of me. And all of a sudden, in front of me, as I'm going through this small intersection kind of thing, is one of those signs that tells me that the road is now divided, which means my side of traffic is going one way, but on the other side of this island, it's coming the other way. Now, I grew up near there. I drove down there all the time. I knew the area. So I'm like, oh man, I don't want to hit that sign. So I just naturally went on the other side of it. And now I know I'm on the wrong side of the road, clearly. But I knew I didn't have to go down that far before the road hit a curve. And then that's where the highway ramp is because the traffic coming the other way came from that direction. So I'm heading down that side of the road. I know that it's late and it's dark, and there's a pretty sharp curve coming up. And I'm thinking, I got to get down there and get onto that highway ramp because some drunk could be out there and won't see me driving on the wrong side of the road and we can get killed. I'm coming down, and instead of taking that curve, I had a small pickup truck. So I figured, let me just drive through this little grassy area and hop on the ramp. There were no guardrails or anything. This great plan I had. So I go onto the grass, and there was a dirt pile. I didn't see it, and I hit it. And the way all the physics fell into line, my truck flipped head over. And from what I learned later, she died instantly. I did not
Mm.
know that at the time of the crash. I didn't know it till much later that night. But people were around in the area. My truck was upside down. I know I got out, but people pulled me away, and I kept wanting to go back to the truck. I wanted, where is she, whatever, and they just wouldn't let me. So I ended up in an ambulance eventually. So did she, separate ambulances, and I ended up at the hospital. They were checking me for internal injuries, and there was nothing. I wasn't injured at all. I had a little bit of a bloody nose because my face hit the steering wheel when we flipped, but that was about it. And they had called my parents to come down. My parents got there. By now it's like 3 in the morning or maybe even later. And my mom asked where my girlfriend was. And I said, I don't know. They're not telling me anything. I don't know what happened. She was with me when this happened, but I don't know what happened. So they go out and they find out. They told my parents that she had passed away. And so now I get that news and I'm like, holy crap. I already knew at the crash scene that it wasn't good. And I remember a moment where I felt like I was on my knees inside my own heart, and I clearly got the message that there was nowhere to go, that I wasn't going to be able to lie my way out of this. There was no excuse. My truck's upside down in the field, there's flashing lights everywhere, and I'm sitting here with the glaring truth that if alcohol wasn't involved, we would call this an accident. But I knew in that moment that things were not good, that alcohol was really the culprit here, and my alcohol use, not just alcohol in general. And so I just knew it was bad. I didn't know how bad. And I thought, I don't know how am I gonna do this? And I remember clearly asking God for help. Just,
Mhm.
I don't know what's going on here, but I know that I'm in deep shit and I'm going to need some help and I don't know how to get out of this. And again, that was before I even knew how horrific everything was. Ended up going back to my parents' house after the hospital, and then that was a Saturday night, all ready for the Sunday morning paper front page. The media didn't waste any time getting getting the story done. And right on the front page of the paper, med student killed in alcohol related crash. The thing that was so weird is I had only known her for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and this huge thing is happening. And so there were a lot of, what am I going to do? I'm going through the devastation of all of it and watching other people be devastated, and the guilt, the shame, all that stuff. And then just how how did I get here? What's going on here? And how do I live with this? How do I deal with this? Was all happening immediately, right from the get go. And so by that morning, I had already decided that I just was never going to drink again, because I clearly got that message, and I don't know where that came from, how I deducted that or whatever it was, but that was it. So now we have to deal with, or I had to deal with people, and I had to deal with the legal matter. I was not arrested that night, but eventually my blood test was subpoenaed because they had taken blood because they didn't know if I had internal injuries or whatever. So I wasn't arrested at the scene. And then I didn't know for a very long time if I was actually going to be arrested, if I was actually over the legal limit, what was going to happen. But I did have to secure an attorney and wait. So this crash happened in November 3rd, 1996. The first week of February, I finally got the results of that blood test. And that's when my attorney called and said I needed to turn myself in, that I was over the legal limit. I was going to be arrested for manslaughter, second degree driving while intoxicated. And if I could go to the barracks and turn myself in, we would begin the process of what's going to happen next. And so that was, that was the beginning of knowing that I was more than likely, short of a miracle, going to be incarcerated. And also dealing with the guilt and shame, thinking there was no amount of time anybody could put me away that could throw me in a hole, bread and water, all that kind of stuff that could be a consequence that was severe enough for what I had done. So all that stuff is happening at the same time. About 9 months passed, and I did go to court nearly pretty much every month. There was an appearance, and then they continue it, and this, that, and the other thing. But every time I went to court, Her whole family was there. The Mothers Against Drunk Driving were there. Of course they are, because they're supporting the victim. Because of my actions, all these people have been devastated. And then finally, after, I don't know, 8 or 9 court appearances, I was sentenced to 8 years, suspended after 3.5. And right there and then, they stepped up to me, cuffed me, and brought me down to the holding cell. And I ended up on the bus that night to Niantic Women's Prison, York Correctional. But one of the things that the judge, he did ask me if I had anything to say to the family, and I didn't know that was going to happen. But I was like, where are those words? Some of it's a blur, but I remember saying that I would spend the rest of my life trying to prevent similar occurrences. I just know that. I don't know what else I said, but I know I said that. Part of my sentence also was when I came out of prison, I had to share my drunk driving experience with high school students and also lose my driving privileges for a year. So that was all going to be upon release. So there I go off to prison. And previous to that, I had tried to find out, I don't know, this is a weird part of the story, but a woman I knew was a director of a treatment facility. And so I got in touch with her and I asked her if there were any women who'd been to prison that I could talk to, because here I am researching what my experience is going to be like. And I later learned that most people don't have that opportunity. And so it
Uh-huh.
was just a weird thing that I did. But no matter what those women told me when I did meet with them, it could never, just like I'm not going to be able to convey the actual intensity of the experience of being incarcerated. And there are so many of us that work in the field of reentry and try to affect change and all of that kind of stuff. But really conveying what the experience is really a difficult thing to do, because I wouldn't recommend people experience it for themselves. But without doing that, there's really no way of really feeling it with all of your senses. So anyway, I head off to prison. I'm in eventually in what they call the ice cream truck. It's one of those small transport vehicles. And we end up picking up from a couple other different courthouses. There were only a few of us on that little transport. And then we got put onto the big blue bus at one of the courthouses and ended up going into York probably around, I don't know, 9, 10 o'clock that night for processing. And then we went through that, and already the experience I was having just on the ride was eye opening and mind blowing, because already I started to realize that some of the women knew each other. And I was like, how do people go to prison more than one time? Like, you would have to be in prison more than one time to know somebody who'd already been in prison. So at first I'm like, man, don't I feel left out? Like, I don't know anybody. And then I'm like, oh, wait, that's probably a good thing. And, just watching that, just the women caring about each other. That's what I was seeing, that, hey, glad you're still alive, even though you're on your way into prison. Good to see that you're alive. That was the message I was taking away from all of that. And I was like, wow, so that's where I started to learn about the severity of addiction that brings men and women to prison. And then there was so much more, but that was the real beginning. And then through the processing, when we got there, of course, the strip search, the shower, all those things, some of which on TV that are portrayed correctly and some are incorrectly. The gist of it is that you are processed in, all your belongings are taken away, and you're given your prison garb and all that kind of stuff, and shown to your less than humane accommodations. And it was probably by midnight that I ended up in the cell that I was going to spend a couple weeks in. And I did have a roommate. I remember getting there, and this is true story. I get there and I don't know the protocol. There's no handbook. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I know it's late. I'm tired. This worst day of my life, or one of several. And I'm just going to go to bed. And so my roommate was already asleep. I didn't meet her till the morning. And all of a sudden, over the intercom in our room, Cullen, this is jail, not Yale. I'm like, you hear people say stuff like that and all that, but all of a sudden, this corrections officer that I haven't met yet just decides that he's going to mess with me already 1 minute after I'm in. And I'm like, oh, so I didn't say anything. Of course, I have to say, I wasn't really scared more than I was shocked. Like, what the hell is wrong with these people? And that I walked around like that for a long time. What the hell is wrong with these people? What is this? What are they doing here? This is not what I thought prison was. Learning where people came from, the marginalized communities who end up with numerous members of their community incarcerated, all that kind of stuff. So for me, a lot of the experience was I had to process my own stuff. I had to deal with how I got there and looking at my alcoholism and whatever I had going on. It was a place of reflection for me. But bigger than that was watching what this system really was and being totally devastated, continuously thinking that as a society, we could do this differently. Early on, I learned that rehabilitation was not the focus. And I was angry about that, but it was also, I just felt so sad that people really in this system weren't trying to help people become better versions of themselves. But then eventually I learned that it was more like a civil war inside. There were corrections officers, and then there were teachers and counselors. And it seemed two different teams working with the same population with different agendas. And so that constant battle was felt everywhere, and it wasn't serving people in the best kind of way. Where I think there's this overall message that people who maybe haven't had any experience up close and personal with incarceration think that once people go through the system, do their time, the objective is to come out a better person, whatever that means, come out a productive member of society. We hear that all the time. But I eventually started to realize that what was offered behind those walls, the environment, the energy, the lack of programs and medical care and all that kind of stuff can't possibly produce that end result. Like it would be a pure miracle. And it is a miracle when people do come out to be that better version of themselves. And it's really an incredibly difficult journey. When recidivism is at the percentage that it is, no wonder, because it is pure hell trying to do positive things, get yourself into some of the programs. And at the time I was there were 1,400 women on that compound. It was
Wow.
overpopulated, and there weren't enough programs for anybody. Now, I was there for an alcohol related fatality, and I couldn't get to any type of AA meeting or anything like that for 9 months or more. And it's just head scratching, right? I could tell you stories all day long about the what there wasn't and what could have been beneficial and whatever. But then I finally, at some point, I don't know when, I thought someone or groups of people, there's some kind of, I don't know, whatever it is that design this system and supports this. Because when people want change and they band together, it's possible and it happens. And there's enough force here keeping this in place. And who is it benefiting? And what is happening here? And why is this inhumane system allowed to perpetuate? What is that all about? And so I started looking at some of that, not the first day I got there, but eventually. I felt like part of the way I coped with being incarcerated was feeling like I was undercover, looking at this system and evaluating and, I don't know, just assessing this situation because it was so mind blowing. And I knew eventually, very early on, that I came from somewhere different than many of the people, and that I thought I was an open minded person. I wasn't prejudiced and all of those kind of things. But what I saw before me was a system that was holding people down, not lifting people up. And I came from a middle class background. I had what I later learned was the privilege of education because I had more than a high school diploma. I could see that what was in front of me, that something wasn't right. But many of the women who are there men and women don't even have a clue that there's something terribly wrong because it's really just a replication of the environment they might have grown up in with the abuse and the neglect and all of those kind of things. So it was a lot to take in. And then early on, I think I was only there a few months, and the principal from the school building, everything that you want to do or need attention for, whatever, you have to write a request for. So there's a form, it's a DOC form, and you have to write it and you fold it in half and put it in the mailbox out near the chow hall. And then whomever's supposed to get that goes through them, and eventually you get an answer, maybe or maybe not. So that's for people who are not feeling well, people who want a program, maybe they have a court date coming up. It could be anything. Everything is done by that system. And so when we're dealing with people and personalities, some of the corrections officers are right on top of things. They meet your needs, they get in touch with you as soon as possible. But there are many who do not. Some of the counselors, same, some of the teachers, same. So, anyway, through this I don't know what it is, institutional mail system, I my presence was requested at the school building. So I went over there and the principal had called me over and said to me, because you're highly educated. And I thought, made it out of high school. I took a couple courses, never made anything of anything, but I'm highly educated. It just stuck in my head. I was like, okay, she must be reading the wrong file. I don't know what the hell's going on here. But anyway, she said, normally you wouldn't be offered this type of a, not offered, you wouldn't be placed in this job or whatever they called it. You wouldn't be working here in the school building, but because of your education, we're going to have you be a teacher's aide and you're going to work in this classroom. So Monday morning, you're going to come here and blah, 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 whatever. And so what I learned, fast forward, the average level of education among the women, and I don't know if it's the same for the men or what's changed or whatever, but this was back in 1997, 98. The average level of education among the women was fourth grade.
Wow.
Fourth grade. If that didn't explain a lot to me, right?
Mhm.
And that's not something that you see on the front page of the newspaper ever. And people don't know that. So when I started to learn these things, I thought, man, if from where I come from, myself and other people are really taxpayers trying to make something of ourselves, plugging along, paying our bills, all that kind of stuff. If the people, if where I came from, people don't know what's happening with their tax dollars. They have an idea of what they think, but they don't really know. And so I thought, if I don't do anything else when I get out of here, I just need to tell people what's really going on. I felt like that was my mission. It was just going to be what I had to do. And I don't know if I had it all put together in an idea like that, but the more I was learning, I was already telling the phone calls, writing letters, all that kind of stuff, because it was just, it was absurd. And it was, I don't even know. I can't even, it was devastating. It was mind blowing. I felt that the whole general public was blindsided, that they had no idea what was really going on. And then, of course, I had that, or do they? Or do
Mm.
they? And so somewhere in there is where I started to know that I wanted to be providing information to people and then maybe be part of a solution. I didn't know what the answer was going to be. I didn't know what the actual changes had to be, but I knew overall as a society, we could just do this differently and we could do it better because we're talking about human beings. We're talking about women. We're talking about women who have children, their mothers, they're separated from their kids, they can't see their kids. Should they see their kids? I don't know. What's better? I never really spent much time thinking about what happens in a prison because I never imagined finding myself there. And so I imagined that other people, oh yeah, prison, it's not cool. Don't want to go there. We tell kids, don't do that, or the cops will come and take you away to prison, all that kind of stuff. But we just know it's something to fear, but we don't really know what we're fearing. And so now I know. And from before I got out, carefully, I was able to share some of what I was observing. I got the feeling that it wouldn't be really safe for me to be telling too many stories over the phone or whatever. Once I got out, then I felt like I was a little more free to share my experience. Of course, it's only from my perspective, but I felt like many of the women didn't really have a voice because they weren't able to see that something was terribly wrong because it was so much like the environment they grew up in, and nor did they feel deserving.
Did you have resistance from the women that were incarcerated as you were trying to explain or show them that it is different?
I can't recall ever having any kind of an issue with any of the women there, whether it was somebody I was trying to teach math to or having a spiritual conversation with, talking about recovery, what we're going to do with our lives, our purpose, all of that kind of stuff. Never any resistance. I pretty much got along with everybody. I think it's mostly because I was kind and compassionate. Nothing much
Mhm.
else was happening with me, just really observing. But the issues are with the staff. It ends up being about power and control. And
Mhm.
so people who think they could manage others by having power over them and control over them with abuse and all of this kind of stuff, it doesn't create this outcome of it's not a healthy relationship, right? If we look at it as a relationship. And then if we have people who treat others with mutuality, respect, and compassion, then the end result is a healthy relationship. And you don't have to do favors for people. You don't have to do anything that's against the rules. You don't have to, if you're staff, you're not going to get in trouble. It's just a different type of a result. There's a different outcome, and it builds a relationship, which ultimately, from my perspective, makes a facility like that easier to manage. Because when you have violent, hostile officers and then you have them overpowering women, the women are going to rise up. Anyone would. And so, if you think about that, think it through. If you be kind and supportive of people, then maybe you might give them a little help and maybe they won't come back. Or
Mhm.
do they want them to keep coming back? Because a million billion times I heard about the people coming back, the women who, the recidivism, that's job security. Because if the women and the men keep coming back, then we're employed. There'll always be a need. So there's something so much bigger. And that's ultimately what I learned. So, this mass incarceration that we talk about, especially in our United States, it's a beast. It's an ugly beast that is generations and generations put in place that I don't even know what could actually change that system. But I'm definitely not in a place where I'm not going to try, and that I'm not going to share the stories, and I'm not going to band with people who are making those changes and all that kind of stuff. But it is so much bigger than what I could have imagined. And then there's this whole other piece that I'll just talk a little bit about, but it's a huge piece. There's something called the prison enterprise. And what has happened over a period of time, anything that a person who's incarcerated might need for their stay. It used to be that you could have a package sent in, people from the outside could get you basic things like underwear, socks, sweatpants, pajamas, sneakers, shoes, those kind of things. Over time, they've eliminated anything coming in from the outside, and they've done it under the guise of safety and security. But what happens now is we have these huge companies that supply prisons with goods in the commissary. But the thing that's happening is those items, and it's also food stuff and health and beauty products, anything you need to get through your day in prison, are all at street prices. So if I wanted to buy a pair of sneakers, there's probably a pair that I might be able to get for 40 bucks. But my job that I have in the school building pays me $1.50 a day. So I'm not going to really ever be able to get those sneakers because I need soap, I need toothpaste, I need whatever. So now I got to ask my family and these communities where people are in prison, all of these young brown and black people, communities that are devastated already. Now they're trying to help out their people inside the prison, sending however much money a week that they can, because they don't want their son or their daughter, or whomever, to not have anything in prison, right? They're in prison, they need to have stuff. So then what happens is they created this system of these kiosks and this electronic bank account funding thing. And every time a family wants to put money on your books, so you have money to spend at the commissary when you get your slip and fill it out. Every time somebody wants to give any money, there's a fee attached to that.
For
So
fuck's
now
sakes.
if I'm a mom who lives in a poor community and I can barely put food on the table, but now my son's in prison and I need to send him a little money, I probably can only send him 10 bucks. And on that $10, there's going to be a $4 charge. And if I can only send him 10 bucks a week, I'm going to send him $40, but I'm going to pay 16 on that. And so that in itself is disgusting. But those are the things that people just don't know about. And I only know because I was really pissed off at those prices and I didn't want to ask my family for help. And so I tried to figure out how could I not ask my family for help. And because I was educated, I was able to work in a different department where I got paid an extra $10 a month because I was able to train some of the women to do the job I was doing. My family sent me money because they wanted me to have those things and they could, but there are families who will do that even when they can't. They'll do it anyway. That whole thing. And then at that time, phone calls were you were charged for phone calls. Now every time I called home, you could get a 15-minute call 3 times a day. That call was $5. So
I
if
had no
I
idea.
happened so some people never talk to their family the whole time because the family can't afford. That's when it used to come on the phone bill and you had to have a landline and all of that stuff. Things have changed a bit now. And in Connecticut, as of I think it was last October, phone calls became free. But the amount of legislation and manpower it took to get that has been just unbelievable.
It took to 2022 for phone calls to be free. For fuck's
Yeah.
sakes.
And I don't even know if that's across the nation.
There's been a lot of work that you have been doing. And so from the 90s to now, how have you moved forward with the information that you have? What have you done? And how have you seen the positive effects since you've been out and taking that rage and that anger at this system and turned it into something positive, even if it's only helped one other person? Is there something you could share about that?
When I think about that, there's probably 3 or 4 major avenues that I've directed my energy toward, and most of them came along serendipitously, and it was just something that I got involved with that ended up being something bigger than I thought it would be. For instance, while I was still incarcerated, that's when the novelist Wally Lamb had come into the prison. He's a Connecticut author. He was a 2-time Oprah Book of the Month Club recipient and all this stuff. So it was a big deal for him to be coming into the prison. The reason he was asked to come in, the morale in the prison was really low because there had been several suicides, the women, young women actually, and the librarian was a childhood friend of his and just asked him if he could come in and do maybe some therapeutic writing to try to help the women or whatever, that she knew things were, we were in dire straits always. He did come in, and because I worked in the school building and I worked with the teacher I worked with was Dale Griffith. There was another teacher as well, but Dale Griffith ended up being the liaison to Wally Lamb coming in. And she put my name on the list. I was the first one signed up to this workshop that Wally Lamb was going to do. And now I didn't know who he was because at that time and prior to that, most of the reading I was doing was self help books. When I finally realized that just buying them didn't help, that I actually had to read them and then I actually had to do the work. And so that was a
Yeah.
process. But in any event, I had a lot of those books. I read some of them, and now I had the opportunity in prison to really go into those files and use what I had learned or not practiced yet. So, anyway, Wally Lamb came in, and I didn't know who he was. I think there were like 30 of us that signed up for this first workshop. He gave us some writing exercise to do and all that. And then the women, instead of sharing their writing, or maybe they didn't write anything, they just wanted to know what Oprah was like because he had met Oprah. A good number of the women only came because they knew that he was on the Oprah show. Then at the end, somebody said, "Are you going to come back?" And he didn't have any clue that was going to happen. But anyway, he said, "I'll come back, but you have to write 2 pages, and that'll be your ticket into the next workshop." So the next workshop had about 15 of us because the Oprah fans got the boot. I understood the value of therapeutic writing for sure. And Dale had encouraged me to stay with it anyway because there were few programs, and anything that I could do to keep myself busy and productive was a good thing. So I went to the next workshop. And then the third time, there were probably only 9 of us, 9 or 10 maybe. And we stayed together writing for quite some time. But that third time, one of the women shared, and this is in the introduction to the actual book that ended up being the outcome of all of this, but she shared a very disjointed piece about her childhood abuse, neglect, basically her trauma. And then the following week, what happened is because that woman shared, the other women were able to share. Then by that fourth week, I thought, what the hell am I doing here? I don't belong in this group because I don't have those kind of stories. That didn't happen to me. And I almost gave up my seat. But then I realized that the prison experience was the trauma, and that it wasn't just my trauma. It was this trauma, what I'm learning here in this group and the connection with these women. So I stayed, and that was probably, it might have been almost 2 more years that I was involved with that until I left. And then 2 years after I left, that's when Wally called me and said that a book was going to be published. Some of our essays were chosen. And he asked me if I'd be available for media stuff. And I'm like, I don't know what the hell that means, but okay, I will. I'm out. I could do whatever you need. So then I'm thinking that they're going to take these pages and put one of those plastic spiral things on it. And then one comes home to the family and the woman gets to keep one. And because I'm out, I'll get two. So then I find out no, HarperCollins is publishing, and it's a real book. And it really didn't hit me till I walked in a bookstore and actually saw it on display. And then I was like, oh, even though I had it, I'd gotten it in the mail by then. We already had some stuff booked and all that. But anyway, so that was one of the things that didn't come packaged as opportunity for you to tell people what's going on in this freaking place. But it gave me a platform to share with many people some of the stuff I had been experiencing. So my piece that was published was about spending 3 Christmases in prison. I wrote about some of the things related to Christmas, but it was also related to the high prices of the commissary. There was a lot of stuff woven into that short piece that gave some kind of information to the public of what was going on. But the other women wrote about their trauma, which was also a big deal, huge. And so I ended up being on the book tour with Wally Lamb. There were only 3 of us that were out at the time, and the other 2 women weren't always available, but I was. A lot of times I just traveled with Wally for 2 or 3 days, and we did these independent bookstores. We were on NPR radio, CNN, all this kind of media stuff. So that's what he meant when he said if I would be available for media. And I thought maybe we were going to do, in Connecticut, we have this one of the NPR radio shows, and I just thought maybe we were going to be on there, but it was quite a bit more than that. And it was really an interesting ride meeting people mostly on the East Coast. So that was one of the things that really gave me opportunity to share my experience. And then, of course, always in 12-step program, the judge that sentenced me also ordered me to 3 months of AA meetings when I got out, and I had to have that paper signed. And because I was never going to have another drink again after that devastating night, I thought AA was only for people who couldn't stop drinking. I had no idea that it could be for me because I was already done. So I don't know why he thinks I need to go there, but okay. I will tell you that I often express gratitude to that judge because I'm here sober 26 years because he sent me to those meetings. I am quite sure that disease that was still alive and well would have kicked up, and I would have been suppressing all of the guilt and shame, because that's what I've mostly worked through. And the rooms in the fellowship, the people, and hearing other people's stories really helped me move through the difficult parts of just having to maneuver through, especially that voice that says, after what you've done.
Mm.
And so being able to manage to have a life above that has really
Yeah.
been because of the fellowship. And then somewhere along the way in the early 2000s, I met a woman named Stephanie Covington, serendipitously through the friend who I mentioned earlier, who was the director of a rehabilitation center, recovery. And so she invited me to this breakfast because this woman was coming to speak. Stephanie Covington has written many programs for girls and women specifically in recovery and affected by the criminal justice system. She wrote the book called The Women's Way Through the 12 Steps. She's written trauma programs, all that kind of stuff. So I met her and she asked me to come out to Minnesota and speak at the conference that was going to be like the next month. I went out to Minnesota. I spoke at the conference. I was trained in a couple of her programs. And then at the same time, she was piloting a program in our Connecticut prison, even though she's from California. Somehow she connected with our East Coast. And she was going to pilot this program called Beyond Trauma. And she was looking for facilitators. So the Women's Consortium was managing the grant that was funding this program. I was trained as a facilitator, and I was able to go back inside and work with the women. And we ended up honing this program. We started off with an 8-week thing, but we realized some of the women went home or moved to another unit or whatever, and then they didn't finish the program. So it ended up being this 5-week, they were calling it healing trauma. And it ended up being that for, I think I did that for about 10 years, being
Wow.
able to go back in the prison. So a lot of women were able to have that program. And some of the women, they come to the first session. When they come to the second one, we ask them, did anything stay with you from the first session? And they will say to us that this is the first time that I learned that what I was going through in my life is called trauma. I thought trauma was only war and gunshot. I didn't know. I thought I was the only one. And then some other women said stuff. And then I realized I'm not the only one. And so that happened in 1 week, one
Wow.
week. And so that in itself, just mind blowing stuff. So I had the privilege of doing that for about 10 years. And prior to that, because the judge wanted me to speak in the high schools, I ended up connecting with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who I thought were the women from hell that were in my courtroom. But I understood their mission, but I didn't really think we were going to be friends. And so now I got to figure out how I'm going to go talk in the high school. So there's an ad in the paper, and it said that this guy from Waterbury Hospital was putting a program together. He was the director of emergency medical. He was putting a program together with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and they were looking for victim and offender speakers to share their stories on the stage in high schools at prom and graduation season. So I'm like, you got to be kidding me. There's an ad in the paper for exactly what I need to do. Call the guy up. I meet with him, Ralph Miro, and I ended up doing that program for years. That led to speaking at a victim impact panel, which was a very new thing for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Same principle. And then Janice Hagee Margolis, the director of Connecticut MAD, hired me as a former offender to run that program. At the time, it just had passed legislation where anybody who had their first DUI had to go to this program. They were court mandated. So we had maybe 2 locations, maybe 30 people were coming or something. When I left MAD in 2013, we had 11 locations and we were seeing over 6,000 people a year. 6,000 people a year in just Connecticut who are basically first time DUI, which means it's actually their second, because the first one sometimes is dismissed through one of those court programs. So yeah, prevalent problems here. And I had the privilege of working with many folks who'd lost their loved ones in alcohol related crashes. I had incredible relationships with different people, and still to this day keep in touch with many of those people. Especially Janice is now retired, and Michelle Letiria also worked under her, and definitely just went to a show with them about 2 months ago. So a lot of these things that I've done have not only been my work in the world, but really a foundation and connections that are lifelong. And all of that has helped me in my own recovery as well. And then there's a woman named Judy Dworin. And for many years, she's had a performance project called the Judy Dworin Performance Project. Recently, it's changed to Justice Dance Performance Project because the Judy Dworin work morphed into being so much more about social justice. And so the board and Judy herself and everyone wanted the organization to more define the work we were doing. So early on, back in 2005. Just before that, Wally Lamb and Judy met at a breakfast for, I don't know, volunteers in corrections. Judy was asked to do a performance there, her ensemble. She wasn't yet working in corrections. Somehow they met, and Wally said, "Hey, did you ever think about doing any performance stuff with the women? They're already writing." And she said, "No, I never have." And she was already doing all kinds of such social issues. So Judy went into the prison, met with the women in the writing group. I was already out by then, and decided that they were going to pilot a little program of residency and maybe create some kind of a performance. So eventually, some of her members of the ensemble go into the prison, work with the women. They created spoken word, dance, and song, and put together a piece called Time In. So many of the women from Judy's ensemble, maybe five or six of them, actually were in the piece with the women and created this thing. Then Judy had the idea, this is a really powerful piece, but only the people in the prison are seeing it. Eventually, she had her ensemble members take on all of the parts of it and perform it on the outside. There's a place in Hartford called Charter Oak. And so they were booked for 3 nights to perform this piece called Time In. And then Judy got in touch with Wally and said, "I'd really like someone to be here who's been incarcerated, because we always have a talk back with the audience about the process of the piece, no matter what work I do." And he said, "Oh, call Robin." So that night I showed up and I knew I was just going to watch this show and talk to the audience after. That was the first time from my experience. So now that was 2005, that I ever really saw and heard something that was similar to maybe the experience of being incarcerated. The stories, the experiences, the voices of the women were, they had come outside the walls. And now the general public, 3 nights, this audience, it's an old synagogue actually. So it was a small audience, maybe 100 people each night, but 300 people now just saw this piece that is probably information that no one ever would have had. And so that was the first time that I was really able to relate and then share my own, especially that part about I come from middle class. I was a taxpayer before I was a convicted felon. You're all taxpayers, and maybe like me, you don't know what your tax dollars are doing. So I was able to connect in that way and continue that. I met Judy that night in 2005, and I have been working with her ever since to this day right now. And we have done such amazing work. Out of the performance residency, which happens each year, none of the ensemble members are part of it anymore. They just are the facilitators and teachers and choreographers. All the women do all the work. They create the set, they do the pieces, they write the pieces, they write the songs and everything. So
Wow.
that's been happening for right up to COVID, 15 years. And then we couldn't go in, couldn't go in, couldn't go in. Then we finally got back in. And this year, just now in June, 9 women performed a piece that they had written and put together under the direction of Judy and her ensemble. So we're back on track. In the meantime, Judy created a moms and kids program because she realized these women were mothers and all they could do was visit their kid across the table. We created a program called the Moms and Kids Program, and We worked with women building up to a visit that was more like activities and quality time. So the prison eventually let us use the school building and we could have a 2 hour visit. It went from 2 hours to 4 hours in the school building where the moms designed activities and then the kids could come in with the caregivers because other people are taking care of their kids while they're in prison. And then they had this visit where they could actually sit with their kids on their lap. They could color, they could read stories, all that kind of stuff that's detrimental to a relationship of a mother and a child. And we continue to do that program, but we're probably 4 or 5 years into it. And finally, we were able to get them to be able to have a snack because at this point, they're just able to visit. So now we can have juice and cookies. Then a couple more years later, we were actually able to provide lunch. We had a woman in that program who had her child right before she was incarcerated. She had never sat down at a table and had a meal with her son, who was now 7. And they ate a lousy Subway grinder, but it was heaven. Or I don't even know if that's what it was, but simple food, but a major milestone. And then we were able to create this weekend thing. There's a camp in Iverton, Connecticut called Incarnation Center, not incarceration, incarnation. And they gave us space there. The families on Saturday, we had probably 20 women who had their families coming, the people taking care of their kids. And then if these folks have their own kids, they have to bring them too because they can't find childcare. So we have those families come to the prison. We worked with the women for 8 to 10 weeks, created this 10 station activity agenda. The kids could have open mic, all this kind of stuff. And we would go in Saturday for 4 hours with lunch included. Then all of the families came over to Incarnation and stayed overnight because it's 15 minutes from the prison. And these kids came from all over, but the thing they had in common was each other having family members incarcerated. We had Saturday night a bonfire. Then Sunday morning we got up, there was a petting zoo. When we got back from the prison Saturday, there was a nature walk, all this stuff. And then we went back to the prison on Sunday for 4 more hours of same thing with lunch included. Then there was a focus group with the kids after the first time. And they asked the kids, what do you want more of? Figuring they're going to say more time with my mom, more time to read a story, color. But they said, we want more time with kids like us. That was mind blowing. They were carrying the secret that they couldn't just share with anybody. And then an after school program was born for children who have parents incarcerated. But we didn't want them to be stigmatized. So we worked with the social workers in the schools to provide children who might have an incarcerated parent, and it could be a mom or a dad, and work with them doing performance work all through the arts, writing, movement, song, all that kind of stuff, moving their bodies and creating some kind of story, but also being able to talk about their feelings and what processing having a parent not there. Then the Department of Corrections came to Judy and said, do you think you could do a dads and kids like that moms and kids thing you do? So Kathy, Judy, and I started going up to Cybulski and created the Dads and Kids program that culminated in a visit for 2 hours where the caregivers could be the baby's mother or one of the guy's parents, whoever brings the kid. And we had 2 hours, but the guys were able to have a meal right away because we'd already done all the work at the women's prison to get those things. So one time we were able to be outside with, maybe more than once, but the guys were giving their kids piggyback rides, rolling in the grass, all stuff that they never would have been able to do. Some of them with 10, 20-year bids, never being able to play with their child that would be in a healthy way. So we were able to do that. Then COVID hit, but we were finally get that program back on track. We've only been able to do virtual visits with the men. By that point, it worked because the men who were in our group had families in South Carolina, Puerto Rico, Maine, wherever. They wouldn't have been coming to a visit anyway, but we could do a virtual where all their kids could be on together. So we did that. And we're back on track. All of our programs are on break right now, but we'll start again mid-September and get those going. So my work with Wally Lamb, with Stephanie Covington, with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, with Judy Dworin, all of these things have put me in that position to be able to continue to share my experience, strength, and hope, and the 12-step fellowship, of course. And then in the process of all of that, I was married, oh, maybe close to 10 years. When the marriage was over, then it was time for me to figure out, where am I going? What am I going to do? Where am I going to live? Then my ex brother in law, his wife calls me and says, "Hey, we finally found a property. We want to open a women's sober house. I don't know if you want to do this, but we'd love to have you come live at the house and manage it." I was like, imagine that. So I came to Killingworth in, I think it was 2017. We got the keys. Hannah is her name. We stood outside and we said, this is going to be great. And maybe 2 to 4 years later, it became great. And now we call it a reality show, Hannah and I, when we talk on the side. And we've named it So You Want to Be Sober. We are in season 6. And when we have difficulties here, we name the episodes. So I am extremely blessed to be able to do all of these things that I get to do. I have a couple of dogs in the meantime. While I was married, we worked with Shaggy Dog Rescue and rescued dozens of dogs, moved them on to their new owners. So I have a couple of what people call fails, but I think they're just my special needs dogs. Life is good. I'm so very blessed. The thing that I never want to forget is that in the beginning that there was devastation and tragedy, and a family and many more people than that were completely devastated by my actions. Even though my life is how it is now and I have all of these really cool things happening, there's nothing that can ever change that for that family. And that's why really talking about recovery and being responsible for our actions and looking at the possible outcome is really important to focus on. And so I never want to forget that that's how I got here, and that tell other people, because I can get so caught up in all of this good stuff in my life, but it's a tricky thing because it's not all rainbows and unicorns from the
Yeah.
get go. There's a lot of really positive, good stuff. I am blessed to be able to do the service work that I do, but I wouldn't recommend this particular path. Healthy choices and learning about the history in your family, especially when it comes to mental health and addiction, is really important because it gives us a lot of information that I didn't get till way later in my life. Might not have changed things, but it's good to have.
That was an incredible story, and I remember pieces of it early on when we had met. We had talked about that, but not to the depth. Is there one thing that you want listeners to know about and how they can make a difference for the men and women that are incarcerated? Is there a message or something that you would like to share that is something that people can do?
Yeah, there is. As a matter of fact, about 3 or 4 days ago, I got this book in the mail, and about, I don't know, somewhere during COVID, probably year 2 ish, Stephanie Covington had gotten in touch with myself and a couple other women who worked with her and had been incarcerated. She asked if she could interview us for a book she was thinking about writing. And she said her working title was Hidden Healers. And she wanted to write about the way women help one another while they're incarcerated, the support they give to each other, and all that kind of stuff. So, long story short, I did the interview. She didn't know exactly what it was going to, come out to. But anyway, I got the book in the mail the other day, and it's way deeper story. It's a lot of stuff that I've talked about already, but deeper and more systemic and nationwide, and talks about her experience working in other countries. But in that book, there are many suggestions of ways that people in your everyday community can help. The book is called Hidden Healers, and the author is Stephanie Covington, Dr. Stephanie Covington.
So
And
buy the book, everybody.
buy the book because she is the expert, and she has nearly 30 years not being incarcerated herself, but the experience of working, especially with women in such a broken system. And the book ended up being really about the bowels of hell
Hmm.
rather than the fluffy, wonderful stories about women giving commissary to each other. She told the story of what's really going on. And yeah, I have not actually read the entire book. I was able to thumb through it, and just what I picked up from it, she went there. And so I think it's important for people to know from that position what your tax dollars are doing, what's happening in our country, why we have this mass incarceration like no other country, and what we can do together. And she suggests that we just blow up all the prisons and start over. Not literally, she's not making bombs in her cellar or anything like that, but
Right.
that we do need to just have something different. We can't really revamp something that's systemically broken. So there you have
Thank
it.
you. Thank you. Gosh, thank you for that. Whew. I'm going to have to sit with some feelings after this, and I would love to have you back again and talk more. There's a lot of different stories that you have of hope and recovery that needs to get out there.
Sure. Just let
Yeah.
me know where and when.
Thank you so much for this, Robin. And I, for one, am really so grateful for our reconnection.
Yes, thank you for reaching out. There's side effects of social media because often it gets a bad rap.
Mm.
There's much good. And now with social media, mostly with the women coming out of corrections, because that's really the population that I work with the most, they're able to find each other and stay in touch and do that same support system that they were doing inside. And I've noticed, because I stay in the background, that the women who were gravitating toward wellness and support, you can find they're all still connected. And then you'll see these kind of posts from folks that you didn't think were really getting it yet, not doing that well. And it's evident in the connections, right? So we have to connect with the people who are doing and being who we want to be. And it can certainly happen through social media and otherwise. And I really appreciate this because there's some stuff that I haven't talked about in a long time, or I don't know if I've ever laid it all out connected that way. It'll be interesting reflection for me as well today. So thank you for that.
As we wrap up today, always remember that within the turbulence of life, there's an extraordinary beauty waiting to be discovered. Embrace it, celebrate it, and share it with the world. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing with your friends and family. Your support helps amplify these voices and ensures that the Turbulent Beauty community continues to grow. Stay connected with us on Instagram at turbulentbeauty23 or email us at turbulentbeauty23@gmail.com to be a part of the ongoing conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts, stories, and suggestions for future episodes. Thank you for being a part of Turbulent Beauty.